Good evening, and thank you for joining the Association for the Study of African American Life and History Social Justice Reading Room. We are so excited to begin this year with the ASALH theme, Black Resistance, and tonight's webinar, Civil Rights in Black and Brown. Social Justice at ASALH is an interdisciplinary initiative that includes workshops, outreach materials, and fellowships focused on social justice community engagement. This series is brought to you by the Howard University Social Justice Consortium and is made possible by the Mellon Just Futures Initiative. Tonight, we love that you will participate with us in this session. Please introduce yourself in the chat and enjoy the conversation. Let us know where you're here from, an ASALH chapter, a university, or what city or town, state that you're from. We will engage in questions and answers at the end of the presentation, but we invite you to enter your questions in the Q&A section of your screen. We have folks who are here who will be moderating the chat as well as the Q&A section, and they'll be presenting your questions to our panelists as we reach that part of our session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our president, the president of ASALH, Dr. Marvin Dulaney. And not only is Marvin our president, but tonight he'll be the moderator of our section. Marvin, would you please join us?
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Marvin.
All right. Good evening, everyone. As you heard, I am the president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. We are very pleased to do these monthly workshops and reading rooms to focus on social justice. When Dr. Carter G. Woodson started the association in 1915, he started it not only to promote the study of Negro history, as it was called at that time, but also to focus on social justice. He knew that in the terrible racist times of the early 20th century, that African Americans needed to indeed highlight their history, show their contributions to American and world history in order to indeed be a part of American society, to fight for social justice, to demand respect, and indeed to be treated like other human beings. This evening, we have a very special book called, and we'll just show it, Civil Rights in Black and Brown. And of course, it's subtitled Histories of Resistance and Struggle in Texas. As you know, our theme for Black History Month for this year is Black Resistance. And so this book fits in perfectly in terms of what we are trying to promote and advocate for 2023. This book is about an oral history project, a statewide oral history project here in Texas. And of course, then there are articles that deal with the civil rights movement in various parts of the state of Texas. Without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Max Kroshmal, professor of U.S. history and Czech Republic endowed professor at the University of New Orleans. He is also author of an award-winning book called Blue Texas, The Making of a Multiracial Democratic Coalition in the Civil Rights Era. Of course, Max has left us and went to New Orleans, but he was here in Fort Worth at Texas Christian University, as you're going to hear, while we were doing this project 5-6 years ago. Our second panelist is Jasmine C. Howard. She is a graduate student, or in fact, a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at Michigan State University. She earned her master's at Ohio State University and her bachelor's at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her research interests include Black women's history, Black women's sexuality, student activism, queerism, resistance, the South, and oral history. She is currently completing her dissertation on student activism at North Carolina HBCUs. Our third panelist is Dr. J. Todd Moy. Dr. Moy is Robinette Professor of U.S. History at the University of North Texas and also Director of the Oral History Program at UNT. He is the founding series editor of the Oxford Oral History series published by Oxford University Press. He is a past president of the Oral History Association, having served in that position in 2017, 2018. His latest book, published in 2013, was Ella Baker, a community organizer of the Civil Rights Movement. So those are our panelists, and I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to ask Max, and by the way, excuse me if I don't use their titles. I've known each of these individuals for years, and so I'm going to call them Todd and Max and Jasmine. So bear with me if we don't get into the titles. So I'm going to start with Max. Max, you came up with this idea to do this statewide oral history project in 2014, 2015. How? Why? What motivated you?
Yeah, well, thank you, Marvin, and everybody for sponsoring this event, for having us here tonight. And thank you to our wonderful audience as you pour in. It's great to see you representing all the different places across the South and nation. So yeah, you know, for me, it actually started even earlier than that, Marvin. And you know, I came to TCU in Fort Worth in 2011 as a brand new assistant professor. And I'd been doing research in Texas history for the project that would become Blue Texas. And I'd started doing some oral histories and doing some with my students there at TCU as well. And it quickly became apparent that there were a lot of people we needed to talk to, and that a lot of them were getting up there in age, and that we were starting to lose some people who were repositories of great information, people who had been incredible activists and had stories in their heads that just needed to be recorded, and that those stories would be essential for producing a more complete, accurate and democratic source base for the teaching of American and Southern history, and for recovering Black history, Chicanx, Latinx studies, and so on. And so, you know, I was new to the area. I was starting to teach a little bit with my students, and I began reaching out to other great oral historians who were in the area. And I had already met, I think, both of you before then, but got to know you a little better, about Marvin and Todd, as well as Dr. Jose Angel Gutierrez at UT Arlington at the time. Later, we added Maggie Rivas Rodriguez from UT Austin to our team. And you know, I don't know if it was my idea, Marvin. I just wanted to record these interviews, and together we came up with this crazy idea of chasing some big grant support to launch a statewide effort and really make sure that these folks got to tell their stories and have those stories preserved and shared widely. I guess I did have the idea for the digital humanities side of it, but I think we're going to talk about that later, so I'll hold off for now. Okay. And I'll just add that, you know, for me, it was such a treat to get to immediately be welcomed by historians who've been doing this work in other places, who've been successful, and who were willing to kind of jump in with both feet to a harebrained idea from this upstart guy down the street. So thanks to both of you and the others for being part of it.
Well, thank you, Max. If you don't know this, the book is edited by Todd and Max. And of course, in it are essays by graduate students, including Jasmine. And Jasmine, let me ask you, how and why did you decide to become involved in this project, and what impact did it have on you?
Well, the quick answer is, it was the summer between me finishing my master's program at Ohio State and me beginning a PhD program. And I was a broke graduate student. So I needed finances for the summer. And I had already conducted oral history interviews for my own project on campus activism at North Carolina HBCUs. So I already had an interest in oral histories. And so when the HNet job came across that you can do oral histories on the civil rights movement and get paid, I was all for it.
All right. Todd, I'm gonna go to you. You've done similar projects. I know you did one in South Carolina when you were working with me. And of course, you did that fabulous Tuskegee Airmen Oral History Project. What's the difference? How was this one? How did this one compare to the one that you did, the two others that you've done?
It was better funded than the first one you mentioned. We created the South Carolina Black Legislators Oral History Project pretty much from scratch using whatever was left over in the Avery budget when Marvin was the director of the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. I was lucky enough to work for him as a postdoc, and we put that project together. But that was one that sort of grew organically out of the Avery's archival collections. We had a good, strong archive of 19th century African American legislators, and we were looking for ways to build on that. And so that particular oral history project grew out of that one. The Tuskegee Airmen Project is another one that was very nicely supported by the federal government. We had congressional appropriations for that one that allowed us to hire a team of 5 full-time oral historians who did nothing but travel around the country and interview people who had been involved in the Tuskegee Airmen experience. So that was just a life-changing experience. It was so awesome to be able to be a part of that and to be in those people's lives for a little while. So I did have the experience of doing a statewide project and a nationwide project before Max approached us with the idea of this statewide project that felt like it was as big as a nationwide project because Texas is so big and so diverse and so hard to explain. The history of resistance and struggle in Texas is so varied, and it's so different in Houston from El Paso, from Lufkin, from Fort Worth. It's very hard to make big generalizations about it, but we felt like the way into it was through individual people's stories that we could then compare and contrast around the state. So when Max initially came to us with the idea, it was a no-brainer. I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk more about this through the course of this presentation, but it's so rewarding to be able to do this kind of collaborative research. Not everyone gets a chance to do it, but if you're a historian somewhere out there who's looking for a new project, there's so much pressure on you, especially if you're in a tenure track job, to write a monograph, a single author monograph. And of course you have to do that. You have to satisfy the people you have to satisfy to get tenure. But if you ever have the chance to work collaboratively with partners like this, please jump at it. It's such a wonderful opportunity, and it's so rewarding. So I'll stop there, but I too wanted to thank ASALH and thank Howard for giving us this opportunity to talk about the project tonight. It's good to be with everyone.
All right.
Marvin, can I just add one thing?
Sure. Go ahead.
I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge, my own graduate training, and that I had this wonderful opportunity when I got a PhD at Duke University. I worked at the Center for Documentary Studies. I was mentored by the founders of the Behind the Veil Oral History Project that uncovered life in the age of Jim Crow in unprecedented ways. And so that was really a model for me, both a model of collaboration, but also to envision, I guess, such a large project and an understanding maybe the urgency and importance of creating this much, larger and more diverse and inclusive source base. And then the other thing I thought of as we were talking was that Texas is vast and diverse, and for me, my research was sort of driven by thinking about the intersections of African American history and Chicano Latino history, and wanting to think especially about African American or Black-Brown relations and sort of the process of coalition building, and that's animated most of my work. And so, for me, it was Texas was kind of the perfect historical laboratory to think about these questions and to be able to see a wide range of experiences. And so I knew from the beginning that it was important that not only was the scale so big, but that to accomplish this, we needed a large and diverse research team, and we needed to have people with expertise in these different areas, with lived experience from different communities. And so I guess that was another sort of driving force in my mind at the outset.
Okay. Jasmine, I want to come back to you, but I want to sort of lay out a conceptual framework, because then I'm going to go to Max about how he developed the conceptual framework for the Black and Brown in Texas project. When I was a graduate student, young and gung-ho, did an oral history project first in Columbus, Ohio, with all of the African Americans who were in the police department. And I guess I did it between 1974 and 1975. Then I got the really big idea of developing a nationwide project where I was going to go around the country and interview all African-American police officers in 11 different cities. Again, I had no idea, I'm going to be frank with you and honest, of what I was getting into. So it worked out somehow. I got lucky. As they say, the Lord looks out for old folks and fools or something like that. But and I happened to be one of the fools of thinking I could do this project of traveling all across the country, interviewing police officers. I eventually interviewed, of course, over 200 or so. Anyway, Jasmine, what did you think when you got engaged in this project, having to travel to different places in the state of Texas?
My project that I spent years on is on North Carolina history. So I was kind of thrust into Texas history. We were given some kind of books and some resources prior to starting our field work, which was very helpful. And we're giving some names to start the process. But other than that, it was, on the go research. I learned a lot of the history of these communities from the actual community members. And so once I interviewed one person, I learned more and more about the history. So then I can ask another person about that history and so on and so on. And so I guess participating in this kind of field work, you get into like the living histories of people. And it was something that I enjoyed, was overwhelming at times, a 24/7 job. And we did this all away from home. And so it was just a exhilarating experience as well.
And Max, how did you develop the conceptual research framework for this project? Did you have any idea this is the way it was going to go when you first brought it to to Todd and I?
Well, maybe yes and no. So my other book, Blue Texas, it began probing some of these questions of trying to think about how do African Americans, or how did historically African Americans and Mexican Americans in Texas find each other at different moments, and sort of gradually sometimes build coalitions for racial justice and to uplift their separate communities and to achieve political representation and real self-determination for their communities. And so that was a story I had been digging into starting in the 1930s and into the 1960s. But I realized in the process of working on that just how big Texas was and how many stories I hadn't yet touched, how little I knew about Dallas, and I was able to get some of your expertise, Marvin, along the way. How Fort Worth was really poorly documented, and that's where I was living, and there had been very few community history efforts there. And so I kind of thought that some of the same stuff I was writing about in Blue Texas, which included the role of organized labor and of electoral politics, that would sort of be replicated elsewhere in the state. And I think it turned out that, moving ahead chronologically with activists in the 60s and 70s and beyond, and then also this much wider frame, maybe decentered those stories a little bit and brought to the fore other themes that were more prominent than I expected. So, Jasmine and her partner recovered all these incredible and terrible stories about state-sanctioned violence against folks of color, against African Americans in East Texas. We found that in other places, for example. We learned, I think, a lot more about the long process around self-determination and equity in schooling that really had very little to do with integration throughout the state. We learned a lot about the Brown Berets, which is a sort of Chicano parallel organization for self-defense, similar to the Black Panther Party, but a Latino Chicano group. And so I guess for me that the scope ended up just blowing up. And so, you know, I knew we would find instances of Black-Brown cooperation. I knew we would find instances of Black-Brown conflict, and really everything in between. That proved true. But I think even more, I don't know, surprisingly, was maybe just what we were able to uncover about the caste systems themselves in Jim Crow and what we call Juan Crow in Texas. And about the agency and the resistance in these communities of fighting those caste systems, the ways in which communities develop very pragmatic and local responses to their situations, and that varied a lot from one place to another. And so, yeah, you know, conceptually, I think those were the questions were what happens if we try to think about both civil rights movements simultaneously, if we put them in conversation with each other as they had been historically, not always. But sometimes, right? They weren't parallel, they were intersecting. And yeah, I'm just seeing questions pop up in the chat about Hispanics and whiteness. And I guess I'll just say quickly on that note that yes, right, Latinos were classified legally as white people, and that there was sometimes, right, Mexican American students could attend white Anglo schools, but at the same time, that classification had a history around treaties. It was in a lot of ways a legal fiction, and so brown-skinned Mexican Americans endured a form of caste segregation that was different, very much different from segregation that African Americans confronted, but there were some interesting overlap, parallel, and moments in which these communities came together because they understood that they had a common enemy or that they had certain things that they could work on together. So we can talk more about that later on, but those were some of the questions, I suppose, driving our inquiry, right? And part of that, of course, I think relates to the present moment, right, in which African Americans are confronted with a nation that has become more diverse. And so that has changed some organizing strategies in some communities, and it certainly changed the conversation about who could potentially be allies in those struggles.
There was a comment in the chat about Juan Crow. Read it when you get a chance. I'm going to go to Todd about field work and what that entailed as we put this project together.
This project existed over 2 summers. And so in the first summer we had, I believe, Max, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we had 4 grad students working with us that first summer, and either 8 or 10 working the next summer. So we had enough support for 4 the first time, and then got an NEH collaborative grant that allowed us to hire more people the following summer. So the director sat down and tried to think of places that other oral history programs might not have been able to reach with, you know, large-scale interviewing projects before, or places that we knew had some historical significance, either because journalists had covered movements in the past, or for whatever reason we suspected there was a story there. So you know, there were a lot of places we could have chosen, but we ended up interviewing in deep East Texas and on the Mexican border for the most part that first summer. And each of the project directors was responsible for a pair of grad students. And so we went into these communities, and Jasmine's right, in a lot of cases we went in cold, but in most of the cases either through newspaper archival research or whatever access we had, we were able to find gatekeepers, and we were able to explain to them what we were trying to do with this project. And for whatever reason, they said yes, they wanted to participate and they wanted to help us. And there's always a moment when you do this kind of work where you're like, wow, I can't believe they said yes. That was so generous of them. And from that moment on, you feel really responsible to, do a good job for those people. But in those cases, in that first summer, I spent a lot of time in Bryan College Station in the Brazos River Valley. I know Marvin spent time in Tyler and Marshall.
Tyler and Marshall.
In Deep East Texas, and Max was on the border working with a pair of interviewers there. So you have to, first of all, you need support from somewhere, and we were lucky enough to find granting agencies that were willing to support us, that allow you to leave home for a month at a time, to go immerse yourself in another place, for weeks at a time. You have to stay in a hotel or someplace cheap, and you have to feed yourself. And because we were in Texas, we were eating at gas stations and small mom and pop restaurants all over the state. And one of the smart things we did is set up a Facebook page that allowed people who had been interviewed and who were interested in being interviewed, and anyone else who was interested in the project could follow along where we were going. But I remember that some of the most popular posts we made that got the most likes on that Facebook page were the gas station meals we were eating, which are probably different from gas station meals in most parts of the country. These are humongous plates of barbecue and sides. But the key is that you go into this community, you immerse yourself, you explain what you're doing to these gatekeepers. They're then willing to introduce you to other people whom you should be talking to. And the project just kind of snowballed from there. And so this is the case in all of the places where we interviewed that first summer. It was also the case with the places we interviewed that second summer. And we came out of it with a dozen research associates like Jasmine, who were experts in these places. And at the end of that second summer, we decided that we couldn't just let that expertise go to waste. That we needed to put this together. We needed to put this knowledge together. So from there, the project moved on a couple of tracks. We created a digital humanities site in which the interviews were clipped and keywords attached and made fully searchable and made fully public, so that people who are interested in the history of both of these civil rights movements could do research of their own. And after that second summer, at the same time, we began putting this book together, and we asked the research associates to choose a topic that came up in this place that you got to know so well. So it could be school desegregation, it could be responses to police violence, it could be political organizing, whatever you see as the major topic that you think is worth exploring in this place. We want you to explore that and to write an essay that's informed by archival research as much as you can.
Let me interrupt you, Todd.
Sure.
I just want to go to Jasmine in terms of talking about a couple of things. One, how she was able to develop the rapport in those communities that you've talked about, so that she got the gatekeepers would indeed refer her to other people. And two, what were the results then of her research in her field work in Montgomery County, Texas?
Yeah, so I think at first, we had to honor that people in these communities were already telling their histories, and they were already experts on their histories. So we respected them, and so we went to people who had already been doing this work, and then they kind of introduced us to more and more people. And I think what was really important because largely we were doing these video oral histories, so people had to be on camera. We told them there's going to be this digital archive, there may be a book, and so we had to get people to buy in. And so people buy in because, well, so and so already met with this person, already met with me, and they know that I'm, all right, and they already invited me. We already did an oral history interview, and it wasn't, any funny business. Everything went well. And also, people generally want to tell their histories and they want to tell their stories. And so I think once we, started doing more and more interviews, more and more people were more open to doing it, and it kind of snowballed from there. And yeah, and so in some cases, we were cold calling people, so we didn't have phone numbers, and so we had to Google phone numbers. Some of them were like dead ends, and so sometimes we would do an oral history interview, and afterwards, like, well, anybody else we should get in touch with, or the information or contact information with this person that we're trying to reach. And so I think recognizing and honoring the community as their own resources was extremely important to the success of the project.
Okay, tell us about your findings. What is summarize that essay you wrote on memory in Montgomery County?
Okay, so I focus on Montgomery County, which is a more rural area just outside of Houston. And so I found that a lot of people know about Houston's history with African American history, but not so much about Montgomery County. And so I was interested in what is it like to kind of, what was the African American experience like in these communities? And so early on in the interview process, the presence of racialized violence and trauma kept coming up. And so I found that people would talk about the man who was burned on the courthouse square. And so they talked about how their parents, their grandparents, their family members had told them about the man that was burned on the courthouse square. And so I kind of thought about how, racialized trauma is kind of passed down for generations, and how, there's the historical marker of the courthouse. But it does not recognize that kind of history of racialized violence that the African Americans in that community experienced. And so, and them remembering that history and continue to live and build and have joy and have community in that area with just a long history of racialized violence, remembering is resistance as well. And I'm interested in commemoration, so looking into naming practices, statues, different things like that, and how something like the old segregated Black education institutions, they were largely shut down during desegregation, but how these kind of alumni groups kept that history in that community alive. So that's a form of resistance as well, especially in the area where the Black population was only in the maybe highest, maybe 13% or 10%. So what is it like to resist an area where you don't have the numbers to kind of to do kind of a long-standing physical kind of direct actions, even though there were some there? How does resistance change when you have such a small population, and what that looks like?
Okay, Max, how did your fieldwork lead you to police brutality in San Antonio? Was that the topic that sort of jumped out at you, or is that one you picked?
Yeah, it picked me, is the short answer. I had first encountered the story of this San Antonio Snick chapter early in my research on the first project, and I had seen a kind of clip in the archive that got me wondering, but I had never really had time to go and fully develop it, and in large part because it occurs after the curtain drops on my already very large first book. So we had a team of researchers there in San Antonio who I was able to direct to some of these people and sources, written sources, but also people whom they could interview. And and I helped to connect them. I actually wasn't part of that round of interviews, but they, Benicio Cinta and Steve Ariones were there, and they did a series of interviews with pretty much everyone we could find that was at all attached to SNCC in San Antonio, and as well as their collaborators and others. And as it turned out, I mean, the story is that starting really in the late 1960s, a group of mostly male college students, Black college students, came together and formed a chapter of SNCC. And the story of SNCC in Texas is a strange story. One thing we learned, I think, across the board were that all of these tales were intensely local. So Texas was geographically far from much of the sort of leading nodes of the Black freedom struggle in the 1950s and 60s. But a number of young Texans had gone and volunteered for SNCC in the early 60s, and then they came back and in the later 60s started chapters at UT Arlington, right, and at other places. And in San Antonio was one of those. And so I didn't really know at the outset, but once I dug into their stories, it became clear that police brutality is what had driven them to organize a case in which a young man had been, beaten and killed by the police in their neighborhood. Of course, the officers involved were very rapidly cleared of any wrongdoing, and that became a way in which they started going out in their community and talking about all kinds of different issues happening on the east side of San Antonio. And they, like many young people, they were a SNCC chapter, but they were at that moment very much talking a Black power talk and interested in self-determination, and didn't see that as a distinction or a contradiction. And they became involved with organizing in collaboration with Mexican Americans who called themselves Chicanos, Chicanas, who were also fighting police brutality in the city, the Brown Berets, and also members of, they formed a third political party called the Raza Unida Party. And so, yeah, these were American descendants of slaves who were doing this work, African Americans, although one of the leaders, his name was Mario Salas, and he actually is descended from Canary Islanders who came to San Antonio very early, although he grew up in Black neighborhoods and had sort of always identified as Black and was part of a Black community, and everyone else involved in the group were also African Americans. It was only later in life maybe that he started to wonder, why is my last name Salas and what did that mean? Anyways, the story led us there, and the struggles to combat police brutality really went hand in glove with, they were organizing Black student unions. They were fighting for Black studies on the different campuses in the city, and they were fighting for political power, and really helped to take down a long time terrible mayor of the city that had been very much an antagonist to both Black and Latino communities there. So yeah, it was a great finding, and it was wonderful to dig deeply into that and to think about, what was it in San Antonio and other places that really did lead many African American activists to form really very close alliances with Mexican Americans.
Okay. Todd, tell us about contesting white supremacy in Tarrant County.
That I chose that subject because I wanted to learn more about the place where I've lived for the last 17 years. I'm not a native Texan. I have not studied Texas nearly as deeply as Marvin or Max have, and I wanted to understand the place I lived on a little bit deeper level. So the story I always heard when I moved to Fort Worth was that we didn't have a civil rights movement here because we didn't need one, because the well-to-do white merchants and respectable African Americans just made a deal, and so they desegregated the downtown lunch counters and things like that, and we just never needed a civil rights movement because everyone was so nice to each other. And that always sounded wrong to me. I took that as a little bit of a challenge to see if maybe there wasn't a little more under the surface. So that's where my interest in that particular place comes from. You know, the more I dug, the more I realized Fort Worth has as many examples of racial violence, white supremacist racial violence, as just about any place else in the South. People who are on the Zoom might be familiar with the Mansfield school controversy, where a federal court shortly after the Brown decision ruled that African American students needed to be allowed to go to school at Mansfield High School, and rather than enforce that decision, the governor sent in the Texas Rangers to keep the African American students out, and there was a riot, and the African American students were kept out. It was essentially the Little Rock crisis the year before Little Rock. So that's part of Tarrant County. There were house bombings when African American families moved into previously all white neighborhoods. There were shootings. There were, you name it, just about any kind of white supremacist racial violence that took place in other parts of the country, the South especially, the Deep South especially, took place there. And so I started noticing lots of different ways that white supremacy was maintained. Often with violence, but not always with violence. And so I started looking for ways that both African American and Mexican American communities resisted that. And it's true that for the most part, they did it in their own separate ways for much of Fort Worth's future. But as the Mexican American community grew in Fort Worth, as civil rights aligned people began to sort of fracture within their communities, so that Black radicals who disagreed with the NAACP approach found people like the Brown Berets who disagreed with the LULAC approach, the MALDEF approach. As they found each other, they began to work with each other. And then, of course, as I finished up the chapter, the George Floyd protests were taking place in Fort Worth as well as the rest of the country. And I was really struck by how many young Latino people showed up for those protests and who identified with needing to resist police violence against their community. So that's the story in Fort Worth. The story of communities coming together across ethnic lines to resist police violence is one that's actually pretty common in Texas. That's the story in Dallas as well. So many of our chapters deal with responses to police violence. Houston had a major effort. Lubbock had a major effort. Far Texas and Deep South had a major effort there. So that's one of the things that that we found across the state that really brought those two communities together to work in coalition.
Okay, well, you know, one of the sort of myths, and there's actually several in terms of Texas history, you know, one of the myths has always been that Texas was not part of the South and that it was more Western than Southern. And therefore, when you talked about civil rights, the discussion almost always related to Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia in those what was called deep Southern South states. So how did the oral histories help us or help to indeed sort of rewrite that narrative? And I'm asking all three of you.
Max, do you want to take first crack at that?
Yeah, well, so I mean, as Todd sort of indicated, you know, a lot of Texas has this mythology around it that that, you know, things were never that bad in terms of race relations. You know, you talk about whitewashed narratives. I mean, Texas history is like the most whitewashed, and in that way it's exceptional. You know, here's a state that was created right because of filibustering white Southerners who wanted to, stream into northern Mexico and set up cotton plantations, carrying enslaved Africans who, they were barred from importing, and they brought them in anyway, and then seceded from Mexico, because of the question of slavery. So, it's foundational in Texas history in a way that Texas boosters, refuse to admit. And so, we have that it was a slaveholders republic, and it was, Todd's colleague Andrew Torgett's done wonderful work to show, quantitatively with newspapers that all they talked about in these moments of the Texas Revolution, and of course all the way through secession, was the preservation of the cotton economy and of the institution of slavery. So that's sort of, along with the genocide against indigenous people and ultimately the conquest from Mexico, right? These are the original sins of the state. And so the boosters story, the standard Texas history narrative that's taught erases all of that. And I think we knew that story wasn't true. Like Todd said, it was a bit of a challenge, a dare. And we thought, let's go talk to people. Let's talk to people who were affected by racism and ask them what their experience was. And let's trust those experiences and draw our interpretations, right, based on the hundreds of people who opened up their homes and hearts to us and shared those stories. And so we learned that there was, in fact, this system of Jim Crow in Texas, right? That there were all the same statutes that there were elsewhere in the South, and that they were enforced, legally and extra legally, in all of the other ways that happened in other places. We also learned that from our Mexican American narrators that in their case, right, they grew up facing a caste system in which they were denied access to equal employment, to white Anglo schools, which they were subject to police violence and state-sanctioned extra-legal violence, and I could go on and on, right? Deny the access to the franchise and so forth. And so, I think that was sort of one big finding of the book. It was like, well, yeah, okay, Texas clearly is part of the South, part of that history. Texas clearly has the Southwestern history of segregation, that is most prominent in South and West Texas, but also stretched elsewhere. And so those, I think we also then saw that people organized social movements. There were these social movements happening everywhere: civil rights struggles, freedom struggles, liberation movements. They went by different names, and they generally were organic, meaning they came from the local communities. Texas was, as I mentioned earlier, fairly cut off from many of the other national civil rights and regional civil rights organizations. But people organized creatively and pragmatically around the issues that affected them and their communities, and they engaged in sustained struggle. And so we found, among other examples, we found from interviews, in Nacogdoches, Texas, in East Texas, that there was this huge mass movement there in the streets. People were protesting. They were, fighting to reform their university. They were fighting for jobs. They were fighting for justice. They were fighting for political self-determination. The newspapers had refused to report on this. There's no paper trail in the city newspaper. They had blacked it out on purpose because they didn't want to, give publicity and encouragement to the protesters. And so it was really only through these oral sources that we could start to uncover a hidden archive of what had actually happened, and to restore those, stories to the record and to their proper place in the telling of history, the narrative of Texas as a whole.
Jasmine, you want to comment?
Yeah, so part of my title of my chapter is Texas Time. And so, we talked about Texas having a lot of mythology. Everything's bigger in Texas, but it seems like when it comes to civil rights recognition and experiences, everything is slower in Texas. So through oral histories and other means, we found like people were battling segregation in schools in the 70s, having violent, contentious battles. We found in the 90s, the KKK were still having very public events and displays. In the 90s in Conroe, there were charges that Black football players were being discriminated against in the 90s. When I was there in 2016, in the area, there were, people selling racist memorabilia and Confederate flags on the side of the road. So in terms of like the traditional demarcation of like civil rights wins and losses, when you look at the local histories and nuances, it may differ from the national story. And so I think that's the importance of kind of not having this one size fits all understanding of history, because there's many nuances. And so, yeah, and so that's kind of what I found in Texas. And also, not only people said in the 90s they still saw remnants of the whites only signs. So that kind of history that people thought, well, that happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and through their oral history, people say, no, we were experiencing this kind of like very violent and bold racism in the 90s and 2000s, and then also comes into infrastructure racism, environmental racism, resources, and different things that people still deal with, particularly in the Tammany community, was the Freedman settlement. They still, when I was interviewing them, it was a struggle to get paved roads. It was a struggle to get control of their water treatment and keep their land. And so these kind of issues that people may place in a past period are still ongoing, and you only get that through honoring people's experiences and listening to them.
All right.
I'd add that Jasmine's chapter is a good example. There are other examples from the collection as well, that just the fact that we created this archive that allowed a chapter like that to be written is a real contribution. There just wasn't enough evidence to write the history of these places before. Max alluded to this a minute ago, but the fact that Jasmine's able to write this, really sophisticated, academically strong historical essay about Montgomery County, Texas, is a real contribution. Eladio Bobadilla's chapter on the Golden Triangle of Texas is a real contribution. These are places where you couldn't have written these histories before this archive was created. So I just want to underline that the archive allowed for this new kind of history to be written, and I think it does prove a very simple point, that Texas was a site of civil rights organizing, of civil rights resistance. It may have looked different from other parts of certainly the Deep South, but to me the comparisons far outweigh the contrasts from the states of the Deep South.
Okay, let's talk about the archives, or the oral history archive that developed from this project, which I think is just fabulous, and I think people would be fascinated by it. And then Max, you can indeed tell them how to get to it. But I want you to start out talking about, and again, Todd, you can also tune in on this. What was the problem with oral history in terms of transcriptions, and of course, reading the text without the context in many cases. So Max, will you start and talk about what we changed with this particular project?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, this archive, and thanks to both of my colleagues for their comments. I mean, that we really were trying to create the archive so that we could change the narrative of Texas history, right? So that people could write academic studies that would do that, and also so that journalists and ordinary people could have access to these stories in a way that often they don't. So the problem, was that oral histories, people have been collecting them for half a century or more, I mean longer, but since the sort of coming of people's histories, right, it emerged as a more popular research method, and eventually gained academic acceptance. The problem was the interviews would be conducted, and then it would take a huge amount of time, effort, energy to produce a transcript of that interview. And then that transcript would be, bound together like a book and put in a library somewhere. And what that meant was that the information inside was not very usable. sometimes there might be an index and sometimes not. Sometimes the tape might still exist and sometimes not. And so as a researcher, it struck me as terribly ironic that this thing that's supposed to democratize history is actually so hard to work with. And it takes somebody working in the archives full time to even find the right interviews that are going to have information related to your subject, to then pour through pages and pages of transcripts to find this moment. And eventually they started digitizing both the media and the transcripts. But even then, we needed you'd have to do like a Control F keyword search to try to find something that somebody was talking about on the tape. So if you were interested in sit-in protests, for example, the transcriptionist could have written that down 100 different ways, with or without the dash, right? Capitalizing different pieces, putting it together in one word, and so you would struggle to find that. And if the narrator didn't say sit in, they might have just said we went down to the lunch counter and protested, right? Then you wouldn't find it at all. And so when they were received as books, they were treated as books. They had a Library of Congress catalog number. And so every single interview that we did for our collection would say, Texas history African Americans or Mexican Americans. And again, you'd never find what you were looking for. So we came up with this idea of breaking the interviews into clips, and rather than put as much time into transcription on the front end, to really focus on making sure the clips each had their own metadata, their own subject tags, of course, the name of who was interviewed and where and all of that, but very specific subject tags using a controlled vocabulary of terms that would allow you to find very narrow information on a narrow topic, that is, by a bunch of different narrators at once, and you can filter by place and everything else. And so the goal was that a student writing a term paper with a few clicks of the mouse could actually uncover a number of different people telling stories about the same subject. They would tell different stories, and then they have to do the work of the historian to interpret them and put them into a paper form. So we wanted students to be able to do that easily. We wanted journalists, because they don't have time before their deadlines, find a story related to this subject in this year in your community. And so we created this website database, and somebody at the TCU library took our kind of wish list and turned it into an actual website that works. And I'll just close by saying we've been stunned by how many people are using it and how many different applications it's finding. Jasmine mentioned before that the folks in Tamina struggling to get paved streets and clean water. We've had quite a few urban planners use those stories from Tamina and from other interviews we did and contact us to say, we're working with X community somewhere in the state to try to deal with these issues, and your interviews caught our eye. And I can't think of another oral history collection where that would take place. So yeah, I'll pass it to Todd, maybe whatever I may have missed.
I can't think of anything you've missed. I'll just underline that, we created the archive to make it as public facing as possible, to make it as usable as possible. Journalists have, as Max said, have really made great use of this. We've also been working with Texas teachers to work it into their own curriculum. I'm going to be working with the Humanities Texas teacher workshop next month, where I'm going to be talking about this and showing Texas K-12 teachers how you can use these examples from Texas civil rights history when you teach about the civil rights movement in your classrooms. So that was a very important aspect of the project for us.
There are a couple questions in the chat about where you can find the book, and also if this is going to be presented at the Oral History Association. I think we've done some presentations at several places, right, already. Have you done one at the Oral History Association, Todd?
We have. We've done multiple presentations there. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the questions was about Black-owned bookstores where people can find the book. One that I know of is the DOCK bookstore in Fort Worth. Yeah, I think they have a website.
And it can be ordered online too.
Yeah,
Of course.
yeah, bookshop.org is another great resource. If you don't know about bookshop.org, and you get to choose which local store you're supporting. So I know here in New Orleans, we can do that and have the proceeds go to Black-owned bookstores.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna open it up to questions from the audience, but there was one question about Juan Crow. Max, did you see that?
Yeah, it seems like there are a couple. I'm having trouble kind of doing both things at once, but sure, I can
Okay.
talk about Juan Crow. Yeah, so the term is new, and you know, evokes different responses in different groups. I'll just say, you know, that it first emerged, Juan Crow, as an idea to think about the immigration system, and I personally find that as a bigger stretch. A number of historians are using the term Juan Crow to describe the state-sanctioned segregation against Mexican Americans during this same period of the early 20th century. And indeed, at previous moments, some scholars, one of our good friends, had written a book about Texas history that was about Mexican Americans, and he just called the system Jim Crow, right? That Jim Crow discrimination against Mexican Americans. I always found that to be a stretch also, right? Because what Mexican Americans experienced was fundamentally different from what African Americans did. It was a different caste system, but it had certain comparisons and certain parallels. And so the terminology of Juan Crow is designed to kind of say it has both similarities and distinctiveness from Jim Crow. And the reason I think we talk about it as a state-sanctioned system of segregation is that's where, you know, that's where the sources lead us. So, you know, we interviewed hundreds of people, and they told us about their experience of being Mexican American, being born in the United States, of Mexican descent, often going back several generations. And in the early 20th century, at the same time that Jim Crow statutes were being created, in South and West Texas, there were a bunch of political changes and economic changes that created this Juan Crow system, a system that was designed to make Mexican Americans stay in the fields as farm workers, to deny them equal access to education, to deny them the independent exercise of the vote and of the franchise, and to force them into segregated neighborhoods. I mean, much of South Texas, you can walk down the train tracks and you can see on one side Mexican neighborhoods, and on the other side, you know, non-Mexican Anglo-white neighborhoods. And then Mexican Americans launched this sustained campaign for civil rights, right, going back, you know, to the 1920s or maybe even earlier. But at, you know, the different moments in which they were challenging in state courts, right, to try to end what they saw as a state-sanctioned segregation system against them. Now, they didn't claim that they were Black, right, and I don't either. They claimed that they were being treated unfairly, that they were being denied due process under the 14th Amendment, or equal protection, depending on the case. They also took action, you know, through grassroots organizing, through labor struggles, through community organizations, through mutual aid societies, through, you know, fraternal and burial societies. They did all these different things to build up their communities and to resist white supremacist restrictions on their communities. And some of them joined groups like LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and filed lawsuits, things that jump out at us as part of the civil rights history. Some of those folks positioned themselves as what they called other whites, as a class apart, that even though their birth certificate said they were white, they were being treated differently. Now, scholars have often told that story, and sometimes it's entered popular media, but that story was never satisfying for me. And the reason it wasn't was that there were all these other people, the vast majority of Mexican Americans, who had no illusions about being white. They were never treated as full white people. They were never treated as first-class citizens. And again, they had all those forms of segregation. And when they stepped out of line, the police came and knocked their heads in, or mobs came and lynched them. I mean, this is part of Texas and Southwestern history. And so, yeah, the vast majority of working class, working people, Mexican Americans, were involved. You know, they organized as Mexicans, not as trying to be white people. And what that meant was by the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they started to build alliances with African Americans, not because they had some natural inclination or because they were the same group or anything else, or that they saw each other as the same, or that they wanted to steal from each other. I think they lived often in separate parts of the city, and just coming together for meetings was a huge endeavor. But over decades, they started to experiment with, hey, what happens if I help you? And tell me more about your lives. And people built relationships with one another. So that in San Antonio, for example, by the early 1960s, like 1960, 61, you know, a prominent Black newspaper in the east side of San Antonio features a front page column written by a Mexican American civil rights activist, right? They're talking to each other. And so we've applied the term Juan Crow to capture that whole caste system as activists understood it, and to think about what are the historical parallels and what are the historical differences. You know, Mexican Americans rarely were segregated by statute, right? There wasn't a law across the state of Texas saying all Mexican Americans must go to segregated schools. And yet there were segregated schools, right? And these were schools that were run by public entities, by school districts, right? They were taught by public employees. If they spoke Spanish at school, they were beaten for it. If they fought back, you know, they were imprisoned for it. So these are state agencies enacting this form of segregation. And so we're still, I think, teasing out all the nuances of that. But I will say that in Texas, this is a conversation that happens on the street, right? It's not a purely academic conversation. And when you go to all the different cities in Texas, Black activists and Latino activists are talking to each other. Sometimes they get along well, you know, sometimes they form really tight partnerships, sometimes they don't. But it's a discourse that's very much part of thinking about, you know, both the past and the future, I think, of the state.
Let me just address a couple questions and comments that I've seen in the chat. One was about Thurgood Marshall coming to Texas. He actually starts to come to Texas in 1938, October 1938, when a Black teacher tried to serve on a jury in Dallas and was thrown out of the courthouse and injured. He continues to come. He takes the case of another Black teacher for equals pay and wins that case in 1943. Then, of course, he's also part of the Smith versus Allwright case, which struck down the white primary in 1944. And then, of course, he's also part of the case of Sweat versus Painter that desegregated the University of Texas Law School. And of course, that case becomes sort of the foundation for the Brown decision in 1954. One of the essays in the book is by, again, another graduate student who writes about the coalition that Blacks and whites formed in the 70s, starting in the 70s, to oppose police brutality. It starts with a case of a young Mexican American being killed by the police. Police officers playing a Russian roulette with him in the back of a car and blows his brains out. It's a Santos Rodriguez case, and that again leads into this coalition between Blacks and whites against police violence in Dallas. Let's open up the chat for questions.
There was a question about what kind of questions we asked in the interviews, and something else about how we, I guess, got in touch with gatekeepers.
Sure.
So something more about the process. I guess I'll talk about it. So in terms of gatekeepers, some people, like, they had already written books about Turner experiences. So I think in the case of Nacogdoches, Richard Orton, he was a photographer. He wrote a book or did a book on a freedom settlement in the area. And so we got in touch with him, and then he got us in touch with other people. And also, like, just people got us in contact with each other. And so if you're a person who knows a lot of people, they will give us lists of names and help us out. And so it was a collaborative process in terms of doing the project. And in terms of the questions asked, I guess Max and Todd can talk about, we had like some kind of questions that they kind of gave us, but it was more of based on how the interviews went, we would ask the questions based on the answers of what came up. So there were some questions about like your experience, your first experience with racism, or did you attend segregated schools? Were you involved in any activism, or your family involved in activism? There are certain questions that we ask kind of everyone, but based on the answers of different people, based on different events we found out that happened in the area, we would add additional questions.
Good questions in the chat. Nicholas, are you going to read those questions to us when they're put there?
Yes, I can start reading some of the questions. We have a couple in the Q&A. One says, what are your thoughts on the current reparations movement after reading the book From Here to Equality? And do you support reparations being paid to foundational Black Americans, those who have identified as Black all of their lives and are descendants of U.S. freedmen? I'm not sure if this is directed to anyone in particular, so.
Well, I'm in favor of reparations. So that's my short answer.
Same.
That's the short answer. I doubt everyone even on this Zoom could agree what that needs to look like, but it's a long overdue conversation for this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then another question in the Q&A before I go back and capture some that were in the chat. Did you conduct oral interviews with Black and Brown residents residing in North Dallas, Prosper, Frisco, Plano, Denton counties, and what were the outcomes?
So I'm zooming in from Denton County. Hi. We did not interview at least extensively in those parts of DFW for this particular project, but that's something that we do at the UNT Oral History Program, and trying to think of others in the area that would be as involved in the northern part of DFW. But in my program, in our collection, I wouldn't say that we have a large enough body of evidence to draw any real conclusions yet.
Yeah. And when you look at the website, you're going to see that it actually contains interviews from, I guess, 3 or 4 different oral history projects. The one that we did in 2011 at the African American Museum, where we interviewed Black educators who were part of the desegregation of public schools in Dallas. Many of them had moved to Richardson and Plano. And so I think the furthest north that we got were some of the Black educators who were interviewed about the desegregation of Richardson and Plano schools in that project that happened in 2011. And we interviewed 35 people as a part of that project.
Yeah, that's a good point, Marvin, that we are interested in these places, but sometimes that took us somewhere else to do the interviews. And so, yeah, we didn't really explicitly seek out those more suburban locations there. We did in Houston, right? In Houston, we went to Montgomery County, we went to Jefferson County, we did interviews in Galveston County, in Southern Harris County, in Fort Bend and Brazoria. But in North Texas, we didn't go as far. And part of that, I think, was just that we all worked there and lived there. And so it felt a little less urgent. And Todd's UNT program has done a lot of interviews with people in Denton and other surrounding parts of North Texas that we can draw on. And some of those interviews, in fact, are on the CRBB website as well.
Great. Our next question says, based upon your project findings, why do you think whiteness or white supremacy are unwilling to accept the true narrative of racial violence in this country and to work towards ways to create a better America for everyone?
Well,
I wish I knew, other than to say that power holds on to power. People who have power use every means at their disposal to hold on to power. And right now, one way that they're doing that in Texas and in Florida and in some other places is by denying their own history, denying our own history, making up stories about our history. And so, one thing we hope that we're doing with this project and with this book is making it harder for people to ignore that or to hold on to their cherished white supremacist myths that have been handed down to them and that they're perpetrating. But that's the question of the hour for this country, and I hope we're able to answer it more satisfactorily soon.
Great. Our next question is kind of a two-parter, but kind of go together. With the present climate against critical race theory in Texas and other places, how are teachers and professors in Texas going to use this archive and your data? The second part to that question is, what are the next steps for this archive and this project related to developing a larger enough pool of interviews that will allow you to draw conclusions?
I can take that first one because I'm thinking about what I want to say to the Humanities Texas workshop here in a couple of weeks. The words critical race theory don't appear, I don't think, anywhere in our archive. We're writing about history. We're documenting history, and we're documenting Texas history and American history and things that really happened here. And so we keep it on that level. The Texas state curriculum standards still call for the teaching of the history of the civil rights movement. And so we're trying to give Texas teachers as many tools as we can possibly help them develop to tell an honest version of this history, and to give their students information that they need. They need this. They need to know this. There are violent, terrible, really disappointing stories in this history, but there are also very inspiring stories in this history, and our students need that. So I hope I hope I answered the first part of that question. I'll let someone else take the second part.
Max, will you address that second part? You're in New Orleans now, so what's going to happen to the CRBB TCU website?
Okay, well, I mean, I thought the question was also about just the number of interviews. I mean, we did over 530 new interviews just for this project, and we've also sort of consulted and tried to bring in other archives, other projects. So I think there's plenty there to draw conclusions. They're not social science questionnaires. They're life, history, oral history format interviews. The questions are open-ended and people get to tell their stories, and then we would, ask follow-up questions and try to guide them through that. So, there's plenty there to be mined, and I'm hopeful that other scholars find new ways to mine it and to use the sources in ways we hadn't imagined. But there's tons, and the website has almost 8,000 clips on it, just those that we've processed and added metadata for. What happens next? I think that's an open question, and we should spend some time together talking about it. We were really excited to get the book finished and to be able to feature these stories from the different communities and all of the different graduate students who had contributed and done the interviews and gotten to write these deep histories of the places. And the website still lives. I think we'll need to think about where does it live, long term. We also were fortunate with our partnership with the Portal to Texas History at UNT that sort of unbeknownst to us, they started transcribing all the interviews. And so now most of the interviews are transcribed on that site, and people who want to work with the full interviews, rather than the clips, have access to that on the internet, and it's there in perpetuity. I was talking with another group of students last night, and they thought we should develop a TikTok page, a channel on TikTok, and have little clips from the interviews. And I was like, I don't use TikTok. I don't know how to do that. But I do think, one of the reasons we created these video interviews and this database was that we were thinking about all the ways in which we can communicate our findings outside of the traditional book, and all the ways in which we can make this information accessible to more people. And so I think there are plenty of experiments still to be done on that. And, I welcome any ideas about or offers from people who want to collaborate and thinking about creative ways to use these sources for the public good.
And I was going to say, like, different organizations, different people have used these interviews for their own purposes. And so people have used it for family histories. People have used it in the classroom, K through 12. I've used it as a teaching assistant at Michigan State University. And so I think the uses are kind of unlimited, based on like who wants to use it. People have used it for like newspaper articles, just many different purposes. People have used it to learn about their elders, about their teachers, about different members of their community. And so I think, you know, having it accessible and not gatekeeping those uses is very important. And also, I will say the project also sent out some DVDs of people's interviews, so they were able to have kind of physical copy of their own interview as well. And so I think that speaks to the importance of the project and the accessibility of it.
Okay. Other questions? There's one.
Nick, do you have it? Or?
You can go ahead, Christina, if you had something you wanted to add.
Just something, a really quick question was, what were the age ranges of the people you've interviewed thus far?
I'll start that. Yeah, you know, our effort was to start with elderly folks and seniors in the communities and really try to reach people who, you know, whose memories may be fading or who may be experiencing, you know, before they experience more severe health issues, things like that. But we worked sort of backward from there. And so often our gatekeepers were younger activists who were very much involved in their community. For example, someone who might be part of a local museum or an NAACP chapter, or, you know, a local A. Philip Randolph chapter, whatever it might be. And so some of those interviews ended up being with really young folks. I mean, relatively young folks, people in their 30s, or even I think a few in their 20s. So, you know, the goal was to try to get as far back in history as we could. But every interview carried us all the way up to the present. And so we have a lot of musings about, you know, the sort of state of the world in 2015 and 2016 that again, some other scholar could pick up and decide to run with to try to think about that moment. And yeah, I'll just leave it there.
I'll just add to that, a lot of the history we were documenting took place long after the 60s ended. So we were, you know, in some of these communities, the really important civil rights work took place in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And so even, you know, the people who were adults then were not yet senior citizens. They're still middle-aged people by the time we get to them in the 21st century. But Max is right. The bulk of what we did was with senior people who we felt a real compulsion to record while we could.
The questions.
We've got question from Mikey F, who asks, I met an elder who was represented by Thurgood Marshall at Shape Community Center. What role, if any, did community centers play in your research?
I'll say the folks who did interviews in Houston, the Shape Center, they were always there and always talking to different people there. So the Shape Center in particular is very important in terms of interviewing the folks in Houston, the Houston area. In terms of my project, a huge part of the project was about the Clarence Brandley case, who he was a Black man janitor who was accused of raping and murdering a white teenager in the early 80s. And so Shape and other people in the Houston area were part of the activism that ultimately led to him being freed off of death row. And so the community centers were extremely important in terms of the direct actions and activism and providing resources that the communities were discriminated against and weren't allowed to get. Also, community centers were how we kind of got people to interview. We would talk about our project, and people were like, "Oh, you can come to this event." And so they allowed us to introduce the project, and we got a lot of people to interview from participating community centers. We went to Juneteenth celebrations. So community centers, libraries, different organizations were extremely important in terms of documenting this history. And definitely, if you were to, type in different groups or organizations, you can find a lot of the history of those community organizations within the website.
Yeah, I had the same experience in Tyler, in Lubbock. We went to community centers, libraries to do the bulk of the interviews.
Local African-American museums were another really important institution for us. As we found those gatekeepers in those communities, and oftentimes the local African-American museum is centered in the previously all-Black school. And so the alumni from that school have been the movers and shakers in keeping this memory alive. So that was another really important set of institutions around the state for us.
Another question, Angela Serna asks, what gaps did your research reveal that you hope other scholars will continue to work on?
That's honestly a tough one. I feel like we keep calling them the grad students, the contributors to our volume, but many of them now are assistant professors and public historians and fully employed historians, and Jasmine will be one of those soon. But we got in the habit of calling them the grad students, so I'm just gonna call them the grad students, but they covered so much ground in this volume that they're, we couldn't cover every single part of the state, so there are still some, some histories that still need to be written. We're also not the only people doing this in Texas by any stretch of the imagination. I want to be sure that we mention that. So many people are working on these issues in communities all over the state. But I've concentrated so much on how much ground we all did cover that I'm not sure I've quite had time to sit back and breathe deeply and give a lot of thought to what else we need to do.
I'd argue, and this is one of the problems with African American history. There's this, in almost everything before the 30s, there's this gap, I'd say, between the 1890s and the 1930s that our interviews couldn't cover, because obviously most of the people are dead. And there's only sparse information, some Black newspapers, one in Houston, one in Dallas, that would cover that period. So we missed this. We missed what happens basically pre-civil rights, if we can categorize it and chronologically set it up that way. So there's this gap that I've always faced as a historian writing, particularly about African American history in Texas, that we get this a lot of information from, say, 30s, 40s, and 50s forward because of interviews, because of newspapers, because of the civil rights movement. But then there's this gap between the 1890s, I'd say, and the 1930s.
Absolutely. We have one more question, I believe, from Diane Clark, which states, I am a retired educator seeking to relocate to the North Dallas area. Do you have any suggestions or organizations in that area that I may be able to promote the book and oral histories in our current climate consumed with so much hate and racism?
Well, if you're in a fraternity, a sorority, there's a North Dallas chapter, or any organization like that. There's a North Dallas chapter of the Links. There's a Delta chapter in North Dallas. So there's some social and fraternal organizations, civic organizations in North Dallas that she could join.
Yeah, and apart from our book too, both Marvin and I had the opportunity to work with Fort Worth ISD on doing some curriculum work to try to think about, to go back to the question of how do we teach these things. And I think there's a lot of folks continuing that process of uplifting these stories. Todd mentioned the Doc Bookstore before. It's a wonderful community center in Fort Worth, in addition to, of course, being a bookstore. And yeah, I mean, I think, you know, our hope again is to get this story in as many people's hands as possible. And so share the website with your friends and listen to the interviews, you know, read the book, make your own conclusions. But, you know, I think a lot of our conversation today, you know, has talked about to what extent Texas may be different from its surroundings or may not. But I urge you all to just dive deeply into it and try to think about, right, why the narrators tell the stories the way they do.
Okay, with that, I think we're going to end our discussion. And thank you all of you for participating. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Jasmine, for agreeing to be on this a reading room with ASALH. And so, Michelle, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all the panelists for coming out tonight with such a active discussion and such great insight. And I also want to thank the hundreds of people who came on the webinar and participated in the chat and helped us all learn more and experience more through this session. We look forward to seeing you at our next Social Justice at ASALH webinar workshop and hopefully in September at the ASALH annual conference. And we hope you'll go to asalh.org. And if you're not already a member, become a member of ASALH, because that's how these programs are made possible. So again, thank you. Have a wonderful evening and Happy New Year.
Thank you,
All right.
everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everybody.